This is Wargaming 101. I am Adam Ruzzo. I go by the handle Bridger online, and I run the website Sound Strategy Network, soundstrategy.net there. And we usually have a lot of videos up there about Company of Heroes. There's some Rise of Legends videos that I'm meaning to put up there. The next show is going to be about Ruse, RTS games in general, but I'm also working on board gaming articles and things like that. So what we're going to talk about today is the different types of games, different types of war games, and what kinds of subgenres there are to see what you might be interested in, and then I'll have some recommendations if you have any specific interests, and we'll head from there. So let's start with what different types of board games there are in general. You have your standard Ameritrash games that very much prioritize theme. These are the kinds of things that you expect that you probably know about. You got your Risk, you've got your Cosmic Encounter, if everybody ever played that's an old one. Battlestar Galactica is a big theme, just dripping with theme. Then you have the newer games on the block. The Euro games are so-called German games. They really prioritize elegant mechanics over theme. So somebody creates this brilliant design and then it's like, what's it about? Merchants on the Mediterranean. Oh, another one of those. Okay, so that's what Euro games tend to favor. And then war games are the third in this group, and they tend to try to create realistic combat simulations. So let's talk about those and all the different things in between. Here I've put together a little chart. War games fit into this in the one side, and when they come into contact with Euro game style mechanics, we call those waros. When war games come into contact with American style games, we call that war trash. And Ameritrash and Euro games, when they meet, they call those Euro trash or hybrids, but we're not talking about those today. So let's talk more about war games. Why do people play war games? Well, a big part of it's being there. People love to play armchair general. Like, well, if I was there when Rommel had to face the Brits at El Alamein, I would have won and gotten all the way to Cairo. So that's a huge factor of it. People love history. They also love to kind of reenact history and say, oh, well, you know, I like learning about this time period. I mean, half the stuff that I know about World War II, I learned from playing war games. So there's certainly that. And there's also direct conflict. People that play war games are usually the kind of people that are competitive. They're the kind of people that would go out and play sports, but the sun is bright, and I'm going to stay in the basement. So it's your mind versus another. Same reason people play chess. It's like I want to try and put my mind to this and beat somebody else, or at least not get beaten horribly badly. So let's move on. There's a bunch of different complexity levels of war games. You could jump into the shallow end of the deep end of the pool, wherever you want to go. And starting with the lighter section, they're very easy to learn. You can sit down with somebody who knows how to play, and they can teach it to you less than 15 minutes easy. Boom, done. Playing time, sometimes an hour, 2 hours probably at most for these lighter games. The medium ones are more complicated. Usually you want to send somebody the rules, send them the rules online, linked, have both people read them ahead of time before you get started. Otherwise it could be 40, 45 minutes of rules explanations before you get into the game. Then there's the heavy war games. Heavy war games are usually only undertaken by people who have grown bored of the medium complexity board games and are like, you know what, I could use a rule game, a board game with 100 pages of rules for me to memorize before I actually get into it. I think that would help my social life. Anyway, so they usually are very complicated, but people will jump into them because they have learned enough about war games in general that moving on to the next step is not nearly as huge as I've just made it sound, because you've already got all of the conventions down from other games. So the heavy games can take 2 to 20 hours or even more than that to actually finish. So let's talk about the different subgenres of war games. The classic hex encounter game. This is the one that you think about when you think of those old guys sitting over a table pushing little pieces of cardboard around. They typically have hexes and counters. Hexes, the very ideal shape that can make a nice grid that creates very decent maneuvering capabilities, better than squares. Absolutely better than squares. They usually are fairly large because these tend to be the games that people are trying to create realistic combat simulations. Like, this is no Ameritrash game where it's going to be cool and we're going to paste on a cool StarCraft theme. This is like, Rommel could not have done that because of this rule. And so they are larger rule books, they're simulations, less gamey mechanics. It's not like, oh, you know, it would be cool if we put these cards in that would let people call in artillery. They did not have artillery at that battle! So that's the kind of games we're talking about here. Advanced Squad Leader, Combat Commander, The Devil's Cauldron, A Victory Lost. Let's take a look at what some of these kind of look like. Here's Advanced Squad Leader. Advanced Squad Leader is a very low-level game where we're talking about, each of these little chits on the board, the plastic, the cardboard counters there, represents like 10 guys maybe, if you're talking about that. Here's a Victory Lost. This is another hex encounter game, but it's a very different scale. You're talking, this entire map here is like Western Russia. That whole thing is Western Russia. And the previous map we looked was like maybe a city wide. So we can have different scales. Combat Commander, one of my favorites. This one is a very smaller scale as well, similar to Advanced Squad Leader. Speaking of these counters, if you haven't seen these before, this is kind of what they look like. And this one in particular represents either single people, small groups of people, or maybe slightly larger groups of people, up to 12 guys. The numbers will represent different things based on the game system, like firepower, their range, their movement capabilities, how likely they are to go, and hide. And then, speaking of counters, sometimes there's a lot of counters. That is almost all of the counters to the game called the Devil's Cauldron. So you can imagine, before you even get to play this game, that's probably, for the guy who put this together, that's probably 20 hours of work, because I'm guessing he went through and clipped every single one of those counters. You don't have to, but people that do this probably did. So that's the type of hex encounter war games, and we'll come back to those in a minute. War trash games are very theme-heavy. They usually have plastic miniatures when you think of war trash type games. They'll, instead of putting around these little counters, there's no life there. You don't feel like you're seeing anything. So you got your plastic miniatures, very colorful artwork. It's all trying to be, look how amazingly cool this game is. You're like here. So this is you want to live the theme. It's very experiential. And other thing is less emphasis on realism. Well, yeah, maybe we couldn't have artillery in that battle, but wouldn't it be cool if we did? Let's do that. I don't care if it's realistic or not. It would be better. It would be more fun. It would be more experiential. So theme is where everything that comes with these war trash type games. War of the Rings, StarCraft, Memoir 44, Twilight Imperium, and Axis and Allies are all examples of these types of games. Here's an example of the War of the Ring Collector's Edition. Very awesome painted miniatures. You've got a bright, nice, colorful board that just screams, play me. Here's StarCraft being played. As you can see, another feature of Ameritrash games, lots of stuff. It's like if we can put more stuff in here, we can charge you more money. It's great. And they all have at least one piece that is completely useless. I think that's a requirement. And here's another one, Memoir 44. Is a fantastic example of a light war game. It's got plastic tanks, plastic guys. They're moving around. You're playing with cards. And, these cards are like Probe and Assault. It's like, okay, well, Assault lets you move 3 guys, and Probe lets you move 2 guys. But there's no realistic reason why you couldn't just move everybody and tell them all to go. So who cares about realism? We're going to try and create a cool game system here. These are games, the first, and usually realistic combat simulation second. Here's the kind of crown jewel that everybody always talks about is Axis and Allies. Slightly step up from Risk, where you have more specific unit combinations and specific sides. Obviously, World War II being depicted. Here's another type of war game that sort of all clumped together and has similar gameplay called card-driven war games. As you might expect, they're driven by cards. So they either have 1 deck of cards or 2 or 3 or 1 deck per faction, where players will draw from the deck, and they will make all of their moves for that turn, usually based on the cards in their hand. So the cards will have events on them. So if it's a World War II game, it might be something like, the stockpile before the big attack on Russia is represented by a card. So you play this card, Lebensraum, living space, which was what Hitler proclaimed when he attacked Russia. That's all we need is living space. We also need to kill all the Russians. But then we'll take the living space. So you'll have cards that try to bring out the historical flavor through events. But at the same time, you have a decision to make, because on this card, you've got this really cool event. Well, this one will give me 3 submarines. Or I could use these points on here to do whatever I want with it. So usually you have to choose between doing some kind of cool event or spending your points to try and get something else done on the battlefield that you need to get done. They also have more abstracted rule system, because usually everything is tied into those points. The points will let you build units, they'll let you move units, they'll let you conduct attacks, they'll let you do all kinds of stuff. It's a very abstract system, but it's still trying to be realistic at the same time. And some examples are Successors, Hannibal, Rome versus Carthage, Paths of Glory is a World War I, Twilight Struggle. Let's talk about Twilight Struggle right here. Here's an example of a card-driven game. This one is one of the very most popular card-driven games that I've ever played. And you see you got some chits on there, and they're basically, there to denote influence, because it's the Cold War, and the U.S. and the USSR are fighting over the countries of the world, trying to get world domination in sort of this underhanded, assassinate diplomats and perform coups in foreign countries kind of a way. So here you see you've got cards that can represent things like the Korean War or the blockade of Berlin, things like that. Here we've got a very different type of card-driven game that still has the same main mechanic. You've got Successors, which is a game that takes place right after Alexander the Great dies, and all of his generals are like, well, this is a pretty big empire. Dibs? So each player plays basically a faction of generals trying to take over the empire and basically claim legitimacy. I'm the legitimate heir of Alexander the Great. And it models that time period great because Alexander dies with no legitimate heir, and it's basically like an episode of The Sopranos because all these guys, there's backstabbing, they steal Alexander's body and try to bring it to Egypt, and then somebody else steals it back because basically at that time, if you have the body of the king, typically the next king buries the previous king. So if you have the body and you bring it back and bury it back home in the capital, then you are seen as more legitimate. So this is all modeled in the game. You can steal the body, and all the players are fighting over who gets the body and brings it back to bury it. It's a very interesting idea. You've got all the great events and things that take place there. Paths of Glory, a slightly different take on it. You've got your chits that have the same kind of representations of attack, defense, movement type capabilities. This is a World War I game, but it's also very popular. Let's talk about block war games. Block war games are a very sort of new system, but they're very interesting. The characteristics is their units are represented by wooden blocks. Instead of little cardboard chits, you've got blocks. So the blocks give you some advantages, because the unit information is only printed on one side of these blocks, which means that only you know what each of these blocks is, and your opponent can't see them. So it creates a great fog of war, where you can go, I'm going to move my tanks all up here, and the infantry's all going to go over here, and he thinks that I'm going to attack over here, and then bam, the tanks are going to come around from behind. So they also can have more than two steps. Two steps are a wargaming term to refer to how many lives, essentially, that a unit has. So if you've got a tank battalion, and it gets beat up and loses a battle, is it just gone? Is it off the map? Does it retreat? Some systems have them retreat. A lot of them say, okay, you turn the chit over. On the other side is its weaker side. It's gotten beat up. It's not full strength anymore. Okay, so that works great. You've got two steps. Full strength, weakened. With block war games, you've got four sides to a square. So you can have slightly more variation. You can have 4, 3, 2, 1 instead of just 1, 2. So some examples of these, if you've heard of them. East Front is a very popular system. Europe engulfed. Fast action battles, the Bulge, Crusader Rex, and Hammer of the Scots are some of note. Here's one in action, so you can see this is East Front 2, representing the Eastern Front of World War II. As you can see, World War II is a very popular wargaming. Probably more than half of the wargames out there are based on World War II in some way or another. Here is showing the Eastern Front. Yes? Go ahead. I love questions. Good.
What do you think that is? Is it just because of some reason that
There's definitely that, but I think the main reason is that the question was for the people on the camera, why is so many World War II games and not others? I think the reason is that it's recent memory. It was also the last war where you have an obvious evil, so that you can make, the Nazis the bad guys, obviously, and that creates the image in popular culture. But the main reason is it was such an explosive time for technology. I mean, before the war, we had biplanes, and we had submarines, kind of, and we had big battleships. After the war, we have single-wing jet fighters. We have, submarines that can travel underwater for, hours and hours and hours. And we have aircraft carriers as the new dominator of the sea. You have this massive change over a course of just 6 years. So you have that, and you also have the fact that there's so many units to model. You've got airplanes, you've got tanks, you've got men on horses still during this time. You've got regular infantry, mechanized infantry, all kinds of stuff. And when you think of Napoleon, well, you got people on horses, you got people not on horses, and you got cannons. And those are the only three that you can do. So that's why you've got this wide variety in World War II. I saw another question over here. There's not many Vietnam games, no. There are, but there's not many. It's also much tougher because it was a big slag of a war. So how do you model as a game something that was really just beating your head against the wall? That's very difficult. Some people have done it, and I applaud them. I haven't played that many Vietnam games. Actually, sorry, I haven't played any. I've seen a few. I have not played any myself. That's not my particular interest. But yeah, it's definitely World War II is just iconic, and like I said, all the other reasons. So let's take a look a little bit more at block games here. Here you can see the actual steps. So you see 4, 3, 2, and 1. So you rotate it clockwise to reduce it in quality, and then rotate it again in the opposite direction to build it back up when they get reinforcements and things like that. Crusader Rex is a game based on the Crusades in the Middle Ages. I don't remember which one in particular. I think it was the last one. Did it have Harrison Ford? I don't know. So Europe Engulfed is a fairly popular one by GMT. That's not formatted right at all. I'm going to fire my... That would be me. So that is based on, let's just take, okay, you're Hitler and you're Churchill and you're Stalin. Let's see what happens. It's just this big grand strategy game of try to rule the world with blocks. Fast Action Battles the Bulge is a much smaller scale. This is only the Battle of the Bulge. Only northwestern France, Belgium, that area there, and the Netherlands trying to break out. Hitler's trying to make his way, his final major push in the West. So this is one of my favorites as well. But just so you can see the difference in the scales that can easily be accomplished by the block systems. Monster war games. This is where it's at if you don't have a job. So characteristics of monster war games is that they're long. I mean, really long. I don't think you understand. You got to have a huge table. This table would probably be sufficient, actually. So they would also be very complex. World in Flames, Eurofront 2, Federation and Empire in Arms are some of the examples that I could find. Some people saying it's a monster game when it has one bedroom and your kids all have to share one. Another people said what a monster war game is. It's a monster game if in order to play it you have to clean out your garage, set the game up on a big ping pong table, and clear out all your next commitments for the next month. Now, there was somebody else that didn't like that definition. They said, a month? You must be playing the beginner scenario. You got to separate your next commitments for like a year. So any game that will give you chronic backache from leaning over a giant table to try and move your pieces for days and months of your life, and that you always come back for more. So that's some people. Here's an example. Eurofront. As I mentioned before, we talked about East Front. That's the block war game. This is East Front plus West Front plus another game called Eurofront. You put them all together and you make the epic war in Europe during World War II. Now that's $100 for East Front, $100 for West Front, and another $100 for Eurofront to bring it all together. So you get essentially 3 games for $300. But that's another thing about monster games is they usually have a lot of pieces. They're usually quite expensive. Now you can probably get that for $240 if you find the right places to shop, and I'll talk about that later. So Eurofront 2. Probably about 50 hours to finish the full campaign. Go from 1939 to 1945. That's a long weekend or 2 weekends, maybe a month if you do one 8-hour day a week, something like that. Maybe 2 months. World in Flames. So this is somebody who said, I'm going to just take this giant thing. I'm not wondering about this table. I'm just going to get a whole bunch of refrigerators and some magnets and put it up here. And I think the magnets are winning, actually. It looks like they're doing better in all sectors right there. So that's Europe and Asia, World in Flames, and other World War II, grand strategy. This one can take up to 100 hours or more. So this is something that you play over the course of a year, where it's like we get together on Saturdays and this is what we do all day. So I want to play it. I never got to play these yet. So Federation and Empire, just to prove that you don't have to be in World War II, this is based on Star Trek, interestingly enough, and it's more than 100 hours. And you can see it's a pretty big table. With a 6-player game, it can be over 100 hours. Then you have the people that get even more crazy, 200-plus hours for War in the Pacific. And is that guy's entire wall? He's got an entire wall dedicated to this game. There's a ladder there so we can go and take care of the stuff up in Japan. I mean, there's some crazy people. This is one of the biggest games that people have ever known. And I mean, except, oh wait, there's the campaign for North Africa that goes up to 1,200 hours. And the talk is that the people who made the game never finished the campaign while it was still in playtest. They sent to ship the game out because they weren't done yet, but they had to sell it. Like, well, we've been playing it for 2 years. It seems pretty good to me. Let's send it out. And you can see there's a kid there to give it the scale. So, but again, most of those actually have shorter scenarios that you can play. Those are the times that if you play the giant monster super campaign, you could get that, but the shorter scenarios are usually more normal, 20 hours for gaming. But mini monsters are things like Europe and Golf. That'll take about 12 to 14 hours. So that's like a 2-day game, essentially. So let's talk about the different scale in wargaming, because you can see we can have lots of different types of wargames. Grand strategic are things like Axis and Allies. You are the leader of the nation. You make all the decisions. You make the diplomatic decisions. You make the production decisions. No, we're going to build tanks. We're not going to build planes this time. We're going to build tanks. You're talking about units that are the size of armies and army groups. Very large concentrations of men, hundreds of thousands per unit. Time each turn is like 2 to 3 months. So you make a turn, and that represents a whole big chunk of time going by. The scope is usually either an entire continent or the world. And like I said, you got diplomacy, army movement, and production are your main considerations. You get a little smaller than that. We call it regular strategic. And you're usually the general of the army. You're controlling the entire army and the navy and all that stuff. You're like the chief of staff of the military. And you don't really worry about diplomacy, because usually on these scales, everything's already been decided. Well, you're Napoleon, you're invading everybody. You don't have to, there's no diplomacy, you're just taking everybody out. So you got time, usually 1 to 2 months. We're talking about a continent. You very rarely see a strategic game that spans the whole world. Those are usually more grand strategic. You still got production and army movement. Supply becomes much more of a factor now, because we're getting down to a smaller scale where you can sort of try and encircle enemies and prevent them from getting supplies and starve them out. Those kind of strategies are very popular in World War II games. You get down a little smaller, you got operational. These are like single battles. We're talking about the Battle of the Bulge. We're talking about the Battle of Kharkov, the battle for Waterloo, things like that. Or very specific Civil War, Gettysburg would be an operational battle. And you're the general of a single army, usually. Maybe 2 armies in the same very small theater. And you're talking about units the size of corps, divisions, or battalions. And about a couple of days to a week would be represented by each turn. So you're maneuvering and things like that. It's a small campaign in the battle. Supply becomes much more important. That's usually the main consideration in these kinds of games. Movement is still important. And also allocation of assets. We're down to the size where you can differentiate between an infantry, anti-tank, planes, ground support, or if you're talking of Napoleonic era, you're talking about maybe elite cavalry versus brand new cavalry, things like that, instead of just cavalry, infantry, and cannon. That's it. No, we've got different variations, so you can get down to the smaller level. Finally, we go down a little bit, well, not finally, actually, tactical. You're the major or the colonel. You're in charge of a small portion of a bigger battle. It's usually the size of a city or less, and it's mostly about maneuvering and firing. It takes turns you about an hour or so, or a little more, a little less than that, for the course of the game. Skirmish is probably one of the more popular ones. This is Advanced Squad Leader, Combat Commander that we showed earlier is a skirmish game. You're the lieutenant or the captain. You're in charge of a platoon, a couple platoons, or a squad, maybe a company at most. So maybe 100 men at the very highest. The scope is a few city blocks usually. Considerations are very much about maneuvering, trying to get advantageous terrain, and trying to do fire and maneuver type things. So if you're in Napoleonic era or earlier, you're trying to talk about hills and getting height advantages and things like that. If you're in more modern combat, it's trying to make sure you control the buildings or the fire lanes, things like that, control the forests. And there is one more lower than skirmish, but it's very rare. It's called man-to-man, which is like you are talking about 12 guys at the most instead of like 100 guys. But that's sort of a smaller subgenre. So I want to talk about the places that you could, if you're interested in playing war games, you could find other people who are interested in playing war games. This is one that I go to on a semi-irregular basis. The Connecticut Central Wargaming Association, they meet in Windsor, Connecticut, in a firehouse in the basement of an old firehouse where they have a whole bunch of tables set up. People usually bring a whole bunch of games, so if you're interested in trying stuff out, just go there and say, hey, I'm new, anybody got anything that they think I could try playing? They usually play, heavier, more complex games. These are more real, like combat simulation, war gamers, conflict simulation. There's no membership fee for this one. You can just show up, and the website is right there. I'll have all of the websites, all the links on here, and all the different games that I recommend will be on my website. They actually are on there now, which is sound-strategy.net. So if you want to check these out later, you can do that. The Connecticut Game Club, I've been down there once. They meet the second and fourth Saturdays of each month in Stratford and Middlefield, so this is more of a southern Connecticut group. And I went to the Middlefield one time. There was a lot more Euro games and a lot fewer of the war games, but you could potentially find some of the lighter war games there, like Memoir 44 and such. They'll free admission to first-timers. The Stratford site is the one that I believe is heavier on the war games, and sometimes they do miniatures war games that's like realistic miniatures, so you have, cavalry and things like that, not the Warhammer, but like the historical miniatures is what the word I'm looking for. CT Game Club is their website, and the Time Machine has started having War Game Night on Monday nights around 6 to 6:30. The Time Machine is right here in Manchester nearby, and they're probably the biggest hobby shop that I know of in this area. They have a decent selection of games. They have a big basement room that they have a whole bunch of tables set up. There's a lot of miniatures gaming going on there as well, War Machine and Warhammer and the like. So check them out if you're looking for that. Huh? I didn't see them down there. I don't think I've ever seen them down there. I think it's probably too expensive and not enough gamers specifically come here. I don't know. So let's talk about online resources. Those are the ones that I have been aware of in this area for groups and things like that. But you can find other groups here on BoardGameGeek.com if you're not familiar with that. It's a huge database of games, and you can search by, type and scale and all kinds of things. You can look up the highest rated ones. You can search by genre, and this is more heavily dominated by Euro games, but basically every war game that I've ever needed, I got a real weird rules question. I can't figure it out. I've looked through the rule book. I can't. You just go on the forum, you ask the question, and it's probably in the next, couple hours to a day, somebody, even the designer himself, has gone on there. Oh, well, here's the problem. It's in, page 13, paragraph 6, section B. So they're very helpful usually. You can get files there. A lot of the rules that are posted online will be uploaded to that. You can see images of prospective games. So anytime I decide, hey, I want to learn more about this game, I always go here and look it up because there's always a lot of good reviews and things like that as well. In addition, local group listings. So if you don't live in the Connecticut area and you're looking for local groups in New Hampshire or New York or wherever, you can go on here and there's a lot of local groups that have posted their own schedules and websites and things like that for the different areas, and internationally as well. Fortress8t.com is an Ameritrash website, but they do have some stuff that pertains to wargaming. So if you're interested in more Ameritrash style games like StarCraft and Twilight Imperium and things like that, that's a decent site. They're basically forums with some interesting articles by some talented writers. So that's them. Consim World is the other big one besides Board Game Geek, and this is the opposite of Board Game Geek. Board Game Geek is mostly dominated by Euro players and a few war gamers. This one is all hardcore conflict simulation gamers. This was the big one before War Game Geek even came along. It's basically a giant forum, and they have sub-forums for each game, for each type of game, and things like that. And there's a lot of crazy good information in here. Horrible interface that you can't find anything. But the people that are on it are very nice, and they'll help you out with questions as well. So if you're looking for more information that you can't find on Board Game Geek, or if you just want to commit suicide, go to this website and ask some people if you need some help, things like that. I hate the interface. I wish they'd upgrade their forums. But they usually get really quick responses. All the designers of the more traditional war games usually have their board set up here, and they'll talk about playtests and things like that. Playtesting's cool. It's when you try to break a game as hard as you possibly can. Playing online. So maybe you can't find somebody near you. Maybe you got no friends who are interested. Everybody wants to play Dominion. God forbid, more Catan. So there are a couple options. You can find and play people online. I had a partner in Singapore that I played a couple of games with over the course of a couple of weeks of Combat Commander. That was really cool. There's a couple of different ways you can do this. Play by email is one way. Not every game really works well play by email, because play by email works where you open up the game software, you take your turn, you save it, you send it in an email, and then when they get it, they'll send it and send it back to you maybe a couple hours, maybe a couple days later. Now, sometimes there's enforcements where if for certain websites that have tournaments that say, listen, if you don't respond to your email within 2 days, then we're taking you on the list, things like that. So that's the way that can work, but it can only work on games where there's very discrete turns. Some games have situations where I have a turn, but you can act on my turn. And if that's the case, it really doesn't work well with play by email. You can fudge it, but it's much more difficult. So the other option, the one that I use the most, is live play. And Vassal is a piece of software. Oh, sorry, I didn't talk about Cyberbox. Cyberbox is a piece of software where you get Cyberbox, and it's just a piece of software, and then you get game boxes. And essentially, the game box is another file that contains all of the pieces, as if you just picked up the physical game and threw it into the computer, and now everything's been digitized. So Cyberbox does not enforce any rules. So if you can only move 2 spaces with this unit, but you move it 3, whoops, it's not going to tell you, hey, you can't move 3. You have to know the rules of the game and enforce them yourself, or your opponent does and have to say, hey, well, stop cheating. So that is Windows only. Vassal, however, is multi-platform. Every game that I've ever wanted to find has a Vassal module. It's pretty amazing. They have a massive database of people that just like, I like this game. I'm going to spend hours and hours making content for it. So Vassal is fantastic. It's multi-platform. It can be live play or play by email. If you're going to play live against somebody else, I highly recommend getting some kind of voice communication like Skype or Ventrilo or some other thing where you can basically chat with them, because it's much easier to figure out rules. Hey, before I move, I can't remember, can this guy, move through trees and then keep going, things like that. So Skype is awesome, and Vassal also is the same way as Cyberbox. It doesn't do, at least not many of them do any rules enforcement. And the reason for that is if you have a self-contained game box that enforces all the rules, and you give it away for free, why is anybody buying your game? So the idea is, you buy the game, that will give you the rules, and then you can play it online for free. They don't want to stop people from playing online, they just want to make some money on their game. Wargame Room, however, is an interesting site, because it breaks all the rules I just said. It does enforce rules. It has a much smaller library, because it's a dedicated team of programmers that just go and sort of, make specific games that they're interested in. And right now, the ones that I can think of off the top of my head is it's got Path of Glory, it's got Twilight Struggle, Battle of the Bulge, different things like, probably a dozen to 15 games on there where it's the complete package. As long as you know how to play as a general way, you could probably fudge your way through it. But knowing how to play usually helps with those kinds of games on Wargame Room. It's free to play as well. If you would like to help choose what new games get developed, you can join as a member and pay, $5 a month or something. And basically then you get a vote to say, what should we develop further? Well, I like Twilight Struggle, but I think there needs to be a new feature in this version of it. Okay, well, you get a vote. So here's some recommendations. If you're completely new to wargaming in general, these are some of the recommendations I would make. Memoir 44, I showed you pictures of that earlier. It is a Days of Wonder title. World War II, small-level combat between tanks and infantry, and lots of plastic miniatures, and it's card-based. It's a very fun little game, great entry, great gateway game. The first one's free, or in this case, $40. Axis and Allies is the other one that everybody plays everywhere. It's sort of it was a Milton Bradley big game that everybody played back in the 80s, and they sort of updated it. The version that you probably want now to start out is the Spring 1942 edition, which just came out last year. Command & Colors Ancients is sort of another take on the same system that uses Memoir 44, but if you don't like World War II, but you do like guys with swords and horses, Command & Colors Ancients is Romans versus Greeks. And then you can get the expansions with throw in, the Carthaginians and all these crazy things. Oh, no, it's Romans versus Carthaginians. And then you can get expansions with throwing the Greeks and everything like that. Now, if you'd like to play a more traditional war game with the hex encounter and the realistic combat simulation, there's a place called Victory Point Games, which is a publisher, and they created this idea of trying to get new people into the whole wargaming thing. So they started what's called the Battle Lesson series of games. Each game, starting from the first Battle Lesson number 1, 2, 3, 4, picks a new thing for you to learn about. So maybe the first one teaches you about how movement systems work in games. So it's a self-contained game, it's a full game, but as you're reading the rules, the designer's also posting, little tips in there for newbies saying, hey, this is why this is going. You'll see this kind of variation on the theme in other games. So this one is all about this. And then maybe in number 2, they build on that and they build another game that's based on a completely different thing. And we're going to throw in supply rules and show you how supply rules work in games on typical things. So the Battle Lesson games would be a great place to start for that. Strike Force 1 is the first Battle Lesson game, and I've got links there that shows all of the Battle Lesson games. I think they're up to 7 right now. And Victory Point Games specializes in lower quality, smaller, cheap games. I mean, instead of paying $50 or $60, you're paying $20. So it's a very significant, but then you get a little plastic baggie with some paper maps and some cardboard. So you get what you pay for, but it's still a very good experience if you put into it what you need. So if you've played a game or two, you've played some You've played some Power Grid, you've played some Carcassonne, you've played some heavier Euro games. You think you got what it takes to move on. Combat Commander is a highly recommended one by me. That's the one I showed earlier. It's card-driven, and it's sort of a World War II skirmish level game as well. And Tide of Iron is also skirmish level, but it's more Ameritrashy rather than being card-driven. It's Ameritrashy. It's very themey. You've got plastic miniatures, and you've got this nice big wooden boards, very high quality. $80 also, though, by the way. It's very expensive from Fantasy Flight. High quality, but also high price. No Retreat is the opposite. That's from Victory Point Games. It's very low quality, very low price, but a very good game. If you actually get past the components, it's a paper map and these pieces of cardboard that are moving around, but that's what most war games are. Then you've got No Retreat is a fantastic option. It's a Eastern Front of World War II game, and I think they did a very good job abstracting it and putting it into an 8-page rulebook without making it too complicated. Conflict of Heroes is one that people always mention as a good gateway game. It's a little bit simpler than Combat Commander, and it's got a good programmable instruction booklet, which means in Scenario 1, we teach you about infantry. In Scenario 2, we teach you about infantry and guns. And then in Scenario 3, we teach you about tanks. And in Scenario 4, we talk about multiplayer. So each scenario builds on the previous one and gets more complicated, which is a great way for people to learn those types of games. Victory, the Blocks of War, has been recommended by a number of people. It's basically World War II, but instead of having real, art history, let's just take tanks and planes and all the World War II technology and this random map that we made and just play the East Front system simplified down into nothing. So I've heard really good things about Victory. I'm actually looking and checking out myself. Twilight Struggle again, awesome game. Number 4 rated game of all time on Board Game Geek, and that's a game. That's a website dominated by Eurogamers. So that's very impressive for that. Sorry. Twilight Struggle is about a 3 to 4 hour game potentially. Usually it's more like 3 if you have experienced players, but it can be upwards of 4 hours. Yes. Many of these games will take you a decent amount of time. Combat Commander can be as slow as 2, but probably as high as 3, 3.5 if it's a very long scenario. But yeah, most of these are time commitments because wargamers are usually looking for something more complicated, and as a result, they also want to. I don't want to just sit. Because if you want to have a game where it's me versus you, if the game only lasts 2 turns, well, guess what? Whoever did the best in the first turn is probably going to win. If you have a lucky break, if you had a great, brilliant streak of luck or of genius on that first turn, I have no chance for a comeback. So because these are direct conflict games, they usually have longer time to allow back and forth and allow you to really, whoever is playing the more skilled game over the course of time is the winner, not just the person who gets a lucky roll on turn 1. Now, if you are the kind of person that went and played Quake for the first time and went to, nightmare mode, this is Bring It On difficulty. East Front 2, fantastic game, but it's going to make a lot of people go, what just happened? I read through that rule book and I have no idea what's going on. But if you've played any of these other games, a lot of it will make sense to you. So don't get too scared off of these. Fast Action Battles, The Bulge, another block war game, is one of my personal favorites. I played it yesterday actually with my brother. It took 6 hours. It's an all-time record for us. Successors is a great 4-player war game, but it's also, if you've never played these types of card-driven games before, it could be a little overwhelming. So I'd recommend that if you want to, if you're ready for it. StarCraft is also a really great game. I would really only recommend it if you've played the computer game. What's up? Probably shortest, yeah. The name is Fast Action Battles, but what they mean is in comparison to those 12-hour battles, these other games that you got. So, I think the system is actually pretty well streamlined. It just depends on the scenario. We were playing the Battle of the Bulge, and you've got to play potentially like 12 turns. And so as a result, it takes a while. But yeah, StarCraft is a great game for people that have played the computer game. I'm a huge fan of it. It might be a little overwhelming to people who have no idea what StarCraft is, but if you know what the Terrans are and you know that, battle cruisers are air units that can shoot at ground and air, and, Zerglings can't shoot at air, but they can attack other ground units. If you know those kinds of things about StarCraft, you'll probably be able to jump into the game and have some fun with it. Advanced Squad Leader is the real big one on this list. It's very, very popular. A huge number of people play Advanced Squad Leader. It's actually been around since the early 90s or the 80s, I think. Squad Leader was in the 80s, I think. Advanced Squad Leader came out in the late 80s, 90s. And it is decently long. It's the same kind of thing as Combat Commander, but it's significantly more advanced. I mean, an 80-page rulebook and a 3-ring binder to start with, and then you can add on expansion modules. So it can get pretty complicated, but the idea is let's simulate small unit combat as perfectly as we possibly can. We want to provide for every eventuality so things will be as realistic as possible. And to that end, it does a good job. I'm not the super realistic kind of person. I like more gaming mechanics. I like more interesting kind of decision making. So those are those ones there. If you're going to go out and buy a game, I would highly recommend that you go online and buy it from there because you can get it for 20 to 40% less than if you buy it at the Time Machine. I really want to be able to support the Time Machine because they provide a gaming space for people. They provide access to new people to come in and learn this hobby. And I have bought games from there before. But then I go home and I find out that I could have paid $30 less if I just bought it online. And I'm like, is it worth it? So yeah, if you want to support your friendly local game store, Flags, then that would be great. And I would highly recommend if you got the money, go ahead. But if you want to make it a little bit cheaper, Boards and Bits, Card House, and Thought Hammer are 3 of the places that I have bought games from before, and they're usually pretty decent on price. And that's pretty much what I had here. If you had any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. And sound-strategy.net, you can find all the links that I've posted here. Yeah, that's it. Anything? All right. Well, I hope it helped you guys. What's up? Yes, familiar with Diplomacy. Yes and no. I think it would be a Waro. I think it would be a Euro game / war game because the other thing that Euro games tend to have is very low luck. And that game has 0 luck. There's no dice rolling. There's no anything. If you have 2 guys attacking 1 guy, the 2 guys win. Oh, yeah. Well, if you decide it that way, yeah, then what country you play is random. We're talking about Diplomacy, by the way. I don't think I said that for the people on the camera. So, yeah, Diplomacy is a Waro, and I didn't include it in here because I feel it's more Euro game than war game, kind of. I don't know. It should, maybe it should have gotten, I just overlooked it. Battletech. The miniatures, I would call that a miniatures war game. Definitely, subgenre. But as far as, so I mean, the listings that I gave you before, the Venn diagram and everything, that is what my categorization for board games are. But I think miniatures gaming usually lies outside of that because they are basically their own subgenre in that sense. That's how I categorize it in my head anyway. Yes, the painting is a huge sort of culture thing that has to do with the minis gaming. That's true. So that pretty upholds those. And if you are interested in miniatures gaming, Flames of War is a World War II sort of hardcore, realistic, historical type thing. That can take a little while, but it's also, you know, you get the minis, you paint them, you make really cool looking tiger tanks. It's a great thing. I don't have the money for that or the time to paint it. So I've never done it myself, but it's very popular. The Time Machine has a lot of Flames of War minis and things like that as well. Anything else? Space Hulk is an Ameritrash game. I wouldn't qualify it as a war game. Well, Space Hulk is an Ameritrash game. There you go. I listed it now. I'll go back and edit it and put it in. But yeah, if that's it, you guys can leave now. I know I locked the door when you came in, so say what? Oh yeah, Seamus plug SerlinGames.com. There you go. It has nothing to do with war games, but I love his games and they're awesome. So that's that. Man, 1 hour and 1 minute. That's good time. I'm impressed with myself. Thank you guys. Have a good day.